Take the deed, Anais, or we bury you next to your father, Geronimo Kirk sneered, tossing the crumpled parchment into the mud at her boots. Rain lashed against the porch of the Rivera estate, now his estate. Russell Benson's hand rested heavily on his stag-handled Colt, while Tracy Cadafo wouldn't even meet her eyes, staring instead at the wet floorboards. "It's a cabin up in the San Juans," Kirk continued, lips curling around a wet cigar. "Out of sight. You go there, you disappear, and you get to live. Fight me, and you don't leave Durango breathing." Thunder cracked like a teamster's whip across the sprawling sky as Anais urged her exhausted, sway-backed blue roan up the treacherous incline. Durango was a fading stain of mud and deceit in the rear view of her shattered life. Geronimo Kirk had stripped her of everything, her name, her home, her dignity, leaving her only the drenched wool of her coat and a piece of paper that condemned her to the frozen peaks. Down below, the Rivera cattle empire, an expansive kingdom built on the calloused hands and spilled blood of her ancestors, was now a stolen prize being carved up by vultures. The biting wind howling through the San Juan foothills seemed to mock her ascent, a cruel herald of the isolation that awaited. Geronimo Kirk, a ruthless land baron with pockets deep enough to drown a town, had orchestrated it all. He had bought the loyalty of Judge Meral Simonson, twisting the town's laws until Anais' father was painted as a debtor and a criminal. When her father resisted, Russell Benson, Kirk's feral enforcer, ensured the old man suffered a fatal accident in the stockyards. But the deepest cut of all had come from Tracy Cadafo. Tracy had been Anais' confidant, her sister in everything but blood. Yet, when Kirk offered Tracy a share of the Rivera silver mines, Tracy had handed over the forged ledgers that sealed the family's ruin. Now Anais was an exile. The cabin Kirk had generously deeded her wasn't a home. It was a death sentence disguised as mercy. It sat high above the timberline, a decaying structure originally built by doomed silver prospectors decades ago. Kirk and his cabal expected the brutal Colorado winter to do what they were too cowardly to do in broad daylight, erase her from existence. As the elevation climbed, the temperature plummeted, stealing the feeling from Anais' fingers. The trail narrowed into a treacherous ribbon of shale and ice, hugging the sheer cliffs of the Animas River Gorge. She leaned forward, burying her face in the horse's coarse mane, tears of fury and grief freezing on her cheeks before they could fall. She had nothing, no weapons, no provisions, save for a half-empty sack of flour and a tin of stale coffee beans. When she finally breached the clearing at twilight, the sight of the cabin nearly broke the last remnants of her spirit. It was a rotting wooden carcass, sagging under the weight of early snow. The roof was partially caved in, the windows were toothless gaps howling with the wind, and the door hung off a single rusted iron hinge. Inside, the floorboards were slick with black ice. A rusted cast-iron stove stood in the corner, its belly full of dead, damp ashes. Anais slid from her horse, her legs giving way the moment her boots hit the frozen earth. She collapsed into the snow, the utter isolation of the mountains pressing down on her chest like an anvil. Down in the valley, Kirk was likely uncorking a bottle of imported Kentucky bourbon, toasting to his new empire with Simonson and Cadfo. They believed they had broken her. They believed she would freeze to death, a forgotten footnote in the history of the West, lying in the snow, watching the stars pierce the violent grey clouds. Anais felt the cold seeping into her marrow. It was a seductive numbness, whispering to her to just close her eyes and let the mountain take her. But as the image of her father's bloodied face flashed behind her eyelids, a spark of pure, unadulterated hatred ignited in the center of her chest. It was a small, hot ember, but it was enough. She forced herself to her hands and knees, her breath pluming in the frigid air. She would not die here. She would survive this frozen hell, and when she did, she would return to Durango to burn their world to the ground. Survival was an ugly, desperate thing. The first 2 weeks in the high San Juans stripped away every ounce of Anais's aristocratic upbringing. She patched the cabin's gaping wounds with frozen mud, pine boughs, and strips of canvas torn from her saddlebags. She learned to trap marmots and snowshoe hares using snares fashioned from horsehair and rusted wire. But the winter was a relentless adversary, and starvation was a slow, creeping shadow. By the 3rd week, a massive blizzard swallowed the peaks. The snow piled up past the windows, trapping Anais inside the dark, suffocating box of the cabin. Her flour was gone. Her firewood was dwindling to a few damp logs. Fever set in, painting her waking hours with delirious visions of Durango in flames. On the 4th night of the storm, as the last embers in the cast-iron stove faded to black, Anais curled into a tight ball beneath her single wool blanket, ready at last to concede defeat. Then the door was kicked open. The wind screamed into the cabin, bringing with it a towering figure silhouetted against the blinding white snow. Anais, too weak to move, watched through half-lidded eyes as the figure stepped inside, kicking the door shut. It was an old woman, wrapped in thick wolf pelts, carrying a massive Sharps point, 50-90 buffalo rifle over her shoulder. Her face was a roadmap of deep, leathery wrinkles, and her eyes were the color of glacial ice, cold, sharp, and unforgiving. This was Elizabeth Abbott. Local legends down in the valleys whispered of a mountain witch, a hermit who lived among the crags and shot trespassers on sight. But Elizabeth was no myth. She was a survivor of the brutal wagon trails of the 1850s, a woman who had seen the worst of humanity and chosen the company of the wolves. "You're dying, girl," Elizabeth rasped, her voice like grinding stones. She dropped a canvas sack onto the floorboards. It hit with a heavy, bloody thud. "And you're doing a damn poor job of it." Elizabeth didn't offer pity. She offered fire, skinning a fresh deer carcass right there on the cabin floor and forcing hot, bloody broth down Anais's throat. For the next month, Elizabeth stayed. She became a brutal taskmaster, dragging Anais out of the cabin and into the unforgiving elements. "They sent you here to be a ghost," Elizabeth told her one morning, as they stood on a dizzying precipice, the wind tearing at their coats. "So be a ghost. A ghost doesn't feel the cold. A ghost doesn't feel fear. A ghost only knows unfinished business." Elizabeth taught her the harsh arithmetic of survival. She showed Anais how to track a mountain lion across solid stone, how to find unfrozen water beneath 4 feet of ice, and how to harness the bitter cold to harden her own resolve. But the most important lessons were not of survival, but of violence. "Your anger is a wildfire," Elizabeth said, handing Anais a heavy, beautifully maintained Winchester Model 1873 rifle. "It'll burn you up before it touches them. You need to make it a forge, cold, contained, and devastating." Under Elizabeth's relentless tutelage, Anais learned the mechanics of death. She learned to account for the wind whipping off the jagged peaks, the drop of a bullet over 500 yards, and the steady, emotionless draw of a breath before pulling the trigger. The aristocratic heiress died in the snowdrifts of the San Juans. In her place, something harder, colder, and utterly untouchable was forged from the ice. Spring came to the San Juans, not with a gentle thaw, but with violent avalanches and roaring, flooded rivers. 6 months had passed since Geronimo Kirk had thrown Anais away. To the world below, Anais Rivera was dead, buried under 20 feet of winter snow. But high in the thin, pristine air, she was more alive than she had ever been. Her physical transformation was stark. The soft, privileged curves of the rancher's daughter were gone, replaced by lean, whipcord muscle. Her skin, once pale and powdered, was deeply tanned and weathered by the high-altitude sun and wind. She moved differently now, without sound, without wasted energy. Before the snow had fully melted from the alpine meadows, Anais had learned to become a shadow. To prove her readiness, Elizabeth had tasked her with stalking a silver-tipped grizzly that had been encroaching on their territory. For 3 days and 3 nights, Anais followed the beast through thickets and over shale slides. She didn't carry a rifle, only a skinning knife. On the 3rd night, while the massive bear slept beneath a deadfall, Anais crept close enough to slice a small tuft of fur from its flank without waking it. When she presented the silver fur to Elizabeth the next morning, the old woman merely nodded. Anais had adopted the total, suffocating silence of the apex predators she hunted. Later that afternoon, Elizabeth sat on a mossy boulder, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette, watching Anais handle a pair of Colt single-action army revolvers. The guns, gifts from Elizabeth's own violent past, were extensions of Anais's hands. "Draw!" Elizabeth barked. In a blur of motion, Anais's hands whipped to her hips. The twin cracks of the revolvers echoed off the canyon walls in a fraction of a second. 2 glass bottles, set 50 yards away on a dead stump, shattered simultaneously into a mist of green shards. Anais smoothly spun the cylinders, reholstering the weapons with a cold, metallic click. She didn't smile. There was no joy in the act, only clinical precision. She didn't even blink at the deafening noise. "You're fast," Elizabeth noted, taking a slow drag of her cigarette. "Faster than most men who make a living with iron. But speed ain't what makes you untouchable, Anais. Any fool can be fast if they're scared enough or angry enough." Anais walked over, her boots making absolutely no sound on the dry pine needles. "Then what does?" Elizabeth stood, poking a calloused, dirt-stained finger hard into the center of Anais's chest, right over her heart. Dead air, the space between the heart beating and the mind thinking. Kirk, Benson, your old friend Tracy, they act on greed, on fear, on pride. They are predictable because they are slaves to their vices. To be untouchable, you must want nothing but the balance of the ledger. You must become a force of nature. Nature doesn't hate the tree when it strikes it with lightning. It simply strikes. You cannot hate them anymore, Anais. Hate makes your hands shake. You must look at them the way the winter looks at the weak, as an inevitability. Anais absorbed the words, staring down the mountain towards the distant, hazy smudge of the valley where Durango lay. She had spent the first 3 months visualizing her return, picturing the shock on their faces, the satisfying spray of blood, the sound of Kirk begging. But Elizabeth was right. Vengeance driven by rage was sloppy. It left room for mistakes. Vengeance delivered as an inevitable, emotionless consequence. That was terrifying. That was how you broke a man's soul before you broke his body. "It is time," Elizabeth said quietly, tossing her cigarette into the damp earth and crushing it beneath her heel. "The passes are clear. The snowmelt is feeding the rivers. Go down there, girl. Be the winter they thought they buried." Anais gathered her meager belongings. The Winchester, the Colts, a gun belt heavy with brass cartridges, and a long canvas duster that concealed her deadly arsenal. She did not say goodbye to Elizabeth. Words were useless between them now. A silent nod of acknowledgement passed between the 2 women. Anais mounted the blue roan, now hardened, muscular, and mean from the mountain terrain, and began the long descent. She wasn't just returning to Durango to reclaim her land. She was descending to bring judgment. Down in Durango, the air was thick with the smell of coal smoke and greed. Geronimo Kirk had indeed built his empire, but empires built on rotting foundations soon begin to stink. He sat in his opulent office above the Durango Bank and Trust, staring out the window at the sprawling Rivera Ranch, now rebranded with his heavy Iron K brand. Yet, despite his staggering wealth, a heavy, suffocating paranoia had settled over his shoulders like a weighted blanket. Things had been going wrong. Subtly at first, then with escalating, terrifying severity. It started with his logging camps in the upper foothills. Entire crews woke up to find their supply wagons meticulously dismantled. The draft horses were unhitched and set free. But more chillingly, the heavy wooden axles of the wagons had been cleanly sawn through, and the saw blades left driven deep into the camp's central chopping blocks. There were no footprints, no sounds in the night. Then, his prize cattle began disappearing from the northern pastures, not stolen and herded away by rustlers, which he could understand and combat, but systematically scattered deep into the labyrinthine slot canyons. The barbed wire fence lines were cut with surgical precision, tied back into neat, mocking bows. "I pay you to keep order, Russell! I pay you to keep this town in my grip!" Kirk snarled, turning from the window to glare at Russell Benson. The enforcer lounged in a leather wingback chair, his boots propped on a mahogany table, though his usual arrogant sneer was wearing thin. "My men are looking, Mr. Kirk," Benson said, picking dirt from under his fingernails with a bone-handled knife. His voice lacked its usual gravelly confidence. "But the timber crews are spooked. Half of them quit yesterday. They're talking about a mountain spirit. Say they never see a rider, never hear a horse, just hear the sharp crack of a rifle from half a mile out, and suddenly their canteens are shot to pieces and their mules are running blind. A mountain spirit," Kirk spat, his face flushing crimson, slamming his fist onto the desk. "I am surrounded by superstitious imbeciles. It's competitors from Silverton trying to bleed me. Find them, Benson. I don't care what you have to do. Drag people into the street and hang them from the telegraph poles until someone talks." Across town, in the suffocating heat of her lavishly decorated parlor, Tracy Cadifer was discovering that betrayal was a heavy garment to wear. She had the wealth she had lusted after. She wore silk dresses imported from Paris and drank champagne before noon. But she could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Anais' face in the rain, staring at her with those hollow, betrayed eyes. To cope, Tracy had turned to the needle, descending into a dark, heavy opium haze that left her perpetually trembling and paranoid. She jumped at every shadow. She had all the mirrors in her house covered with black velvet, because she was convinced she could see Anais' dead father standing behind her reflection, his neck bruised from the hangman's rope Kirk's men had used. Judge Morale Simonson was faring no better. The corrupt magistrate was drowning in a sea of cooked ledgers. Kirk was demanding more land grabs, more rigged auctions, pushing the town to the brink of revolt. Worse, rumors were swirling that federal marshals in Denver were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about the sudden accidents befalling Kirk's business rivals. Simonson sweated profusely in his chambers, a bottle of rye whiskey, his only constant companion. He jumped at the sound of a slamming door, terrified that the federal marshals, or worse, Kirk's men tying up loose ends, were coming for him. The cabal was fracturing. Arrogance had blinded them to their own vulnerabilities. They thought they had conquered the world when they banished the Rivera heiress. They had no idea that the shadow stretching across the valley floor from the Sangre de Cristo peaks was not the setting sun, but a reckoning coming to collect its dues. That evening, the terror escalated from property to flesh. Russell Benson found one of his top-hired guns tied to a hitching post outside the main saloon in the center of town. The man was unharmed, but stripped down to his long johns, his lips blue, trembling uncontrollably in the night air. A crowd of townsfolk had gathered, whispering and pointing. Pinned to the mercenary's chest with a silver Rivera family hat pin, a pin Anais had worn the day she was banished, was a single, blank piece of paper. "Who did this? Tell me!" Benson roared, grabbing the man by the throat and shaking him violently. The mercenary shook his head, his eyes wide, white-rimmed with genuine primal terror. "I didn't see him, boss. I swear to God, I didn't see anyone. I was just walking the perimeter, and then it was just a shadow that smelled like pine needles and the cold. Please, boss, I quit. I'm leaving Durango tonight." The psychological dismantling of Geronimo Kirk's empire began with a whisper, a systematic unraveling that struck at the core of their security. Anais did not ride into Durango under the midday sun to challenge them in the street. She slipped in under the cloak of a moonless night, a phantom drifting through the alleys, completely unseen by the extra guards Benson had posted. Her first target was the weak link, Judge Morale Simonson. Simonson was working late in his courthouse chambers, sweating profusely over an open ledger, desperately trying to balance books that were built on a foundation of lies and blood money. He had bolted the heavy oak door of his office. The windows on the second floor were shut tight and locked from the inside. Yet a sudden, frigid draft made the oil lamp flicker. When he reached blindly for his whiskey glass, his hand met empty air. He looked up. Sitting in the corner of the room, entirely absorbed in the shadows, her boots resting casually on a stack of legal briefs, was a figure in a canvas duster. Who are you? How did you get in here?" Simonson stammered, his heart hammering against his ribs as he reached frantically for the pearl-handled derringer hidden in his desk drawer. Before his fingers even grazed the handle, a heavy throwing knife materialized from the darkness with a sickening thunk, embedding itself an inch from his knuckles, pinning his sleeve to the mahogany desk. Simonson froze, a pathetic whimper escaping his throat. The figure leaned forward, the dim lamplight finally catching the brim of her hat and the icy, dead stare of her eyes. Anais. Simonson stopped breathing. He stared at a ghost, his mind completely unable to process the impossibility of her survival. You died in the mountains. We had reports of the blizzards." "I did," Anais whispered, her voice devoid of any human warmth. It wasn't angry. It was entirely hollow, like the voice of the winter wind echoing through a canyon. "And I brought the cold back with me. She didn't kill him. Death was far too easy for a coward. Instead, she stood up and dropped a thick, leather-bound stack of documents onto his desk, the original, unforged Rivera deeds, alongside a secondary ledger she had stolen from Kirk's accountant earlier that night. It detailed every bribe paid to Simonson, every stolen acre, and the exact sums paid to the men who murdered her father, neatly tied with twine. The federal marshals in Denver receive a copy of this in exactly 2 days, Anais stated flatly, retrieving her knife from the desk with a swift pull. "You have until dawn to pack a single bag and run, Judge. If I see your face in this territory again, if I hear you've practiced law in this state, I won't use a knife to pin your sleeve." Simonson broke entirely, sobbing as he scrambled from the room, leaving his hat, his coat, and his crumbling empire behind. The next night, she visited Tracy Cadafo. Tracy awoke in her silk-sheeted bed, the heavy, sweet smell of opium thick in the air, to the distinct, terrifying metallic click of a Colt single-action revolver cocking. The drug-induced haze shattered instantly, replaced by a spike of pure adrenaline. Anais sat on the edge of the mattress, the cold steel barrel of the gun resting lightly against Tracy's sweaty forehead. Anais, please. God, please. Tracy wept, her body convulsing with terror and a crushing wave of guilt. She reached out, wanting to touch her old friend, but Anais shifted just out of reach, looking at her with the clinical detachment of a butcher examining meat. "He made me do it. Kirk made me. He said he would ruin me if I didn't give him the ledgers." "Choices, Tracy," Anais said softly, her expression as unreadable as carved stone. "We all make them. You chose silk dresses over my father's life." "I'm sorry. I'll give it back," Tracy wailed. Anais slowly lowered the gun. She didn't need to shoot. The punishment for Tracy was the hollow, paranoid life she had built. Anais reached over and swept the ornate glass vial of opium and the silver syringe off the nightstand, letting them shatter on the hardwood floor. "Your wealth is gone, Tracy. By tomorrow morning, Kirk's accounts will be frozen by the bank board. Your reputation is ash. When Kirk finds out the money is gone, what do you think he'll do to the woman who helped forge the documents?" Anais stood up, melting back into the shadows of the bedroom as effortlessly as she had appeared. "Live a long, hollow life, Tracy. Keep looking over your shoulder." By the third day, absolute panic gripped Geronimo Kirk. His judge had vanished in the night, leaving the courthouse in disarray. His accomplice was institutionalized at the local clinic, raving madly about ghosts and shattered glass. And the town bank, terrified by the sudden disappearance of the judge and rumors of federal investigations, had frozen all of Kirk's major accounts. He was hemorrhaging power by the hour. He summoned Russell Benson and 6 armed guards to his office at the bank, barricading the doors. "Burn the whole damn town down if you have to," Kirk screamed, his aristocratic veneer completely shattered, spittle flying from his lips. "Turn every house inside out. Find whoever is doing this and bring me their head." "You don't have to look very hard, Geronimo," a voice echoed from the doorway. The 6 guards raised their rifles, but they were too late. The heavy oak doors hadn't been forced. They had been unlocked from the inside. Kirk and Benson spun around. Standing in the threshold of the office, having effortlessly dispatched the 2 men guarding the hall without making a sound, was Anais Rivera. The afternoon sun cast a long, dark shadow across the Persian rug. Her duster was swept back, revealing the twin Colts on her hips and the Winchester slung over her shoulder. She was not the broken, weeping girl they had thrown into the mud 6 months ago. She was a weapon forged in the ice, standing tall, imposing, and utterly untouchable. For a long, suspended moment, the only sound in the opulent office was the ticking of the grandfather clock. Geronimo Kirk's face drained of color. He looked at Anais as if the devil himself had walked through the door. "It's a trick," Kirk hissed, taking a step back until his waist hit his heavy oak desk. "You're dead." You froze. "The cold is a matter of perspective, Geronimo," Anais said, her voice steady and resonant, carrying not a trace of fear. "You sent me to a cabin to disappear. I found myself instead." Russell Benson sneered, his brute confidence recovering faster than Kirk's. "You're a long way from the mountains, little girl. Should have stayed a ghost." Benson's hand moved in a blur toward his hip. He was fast, infamous for his quick draw, but he was drawing against a memory, against a girl he thought he knew. He wasn't drawing against the pupil of Elizabeth Abat. He wasn't drawing against the wind. Anais didn't flinch. She didn't blink. The dead air Elizabeth had taught her settled over her mind. Crack, crack. 2 shots rang out so close together they sounded like a single thunderclap. Anais's right-hand Colt was smoking. Benson stood frozen, his own gun only halfway out of its holster. He looked down in dull disbelief. The cylinder of his revolver had been blown clean apart, the shattered metal tearing into his hand. Before the shock could register as pain, a second bullet had shattered his right kneecap. Benson collapsed like a felled tree, screaming, clutching his ruined leg and mangled hand. He would never draw a gun or walk straight again. Anais smoothly holstered her weapon, turning her icy gaze to Kirk. Kirk was trembling violently. The arrogant land baron, the man who had played God with the town of Durango, was reduced to a pathetic, cornered rat. He lunged for the top drawer of his desk, desperate to reach his hidden derringer. Anais was across the room in 3 strides. She slammed the heavy drawer shut, crushing Kirk's fingers inside. He shrieked, falling to his knees. "Please," Kirk begged, tears streaming down his face, staring up at the woman whose life he had tried to extinguish. "Please, I'll give it back. The ranch, the money, all of it. Just let me live." Anais looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing. No rage, no triumph. Just the cold, mechanical settling of a ledger coming into balance. "The deeds are already in my name, Geronimo. The federal marshals have the evidence of your murders, your bribes, and your theft. They are boarding a train in Denver right now," Anais said, stepping back from the desk. "You're going to hang me?" Kirk gasped. "No," Anais replied softly. "I'm going to let you live. I'm going to let you sit in a tiny, cold cell at the territorial prison for the rest of your miserable life. I want you to wake up every day and remember that you lost your empire to a girl you threw away in the snow." She turned her back on him, walking toward the door, stepping over the groaning form of Russell Benson. "You're nothing!" Kirk screamed after her, a final pathetic burst of defiance. "You're just a ghost." Anais paused in the doorway. The sunlight hit her face, revealing the hard, beautiful, untouchable lines of her jaw. She didn't look back. "I am the storm you ordered," she said softly. She walked out of the bank, out into the dusty streets of Durango. The town was hers again. But she knew she would not stay. The valley was too loud, too thick with the ghosts of the past. Her home was high above, in the thin, crisp air of the San Juans, where the world was silent, and the snow washed everything clean. Anais's journey from a broken exile to an untouchable force of nature reminds us of a powerful truth. Sometimes, the darkest cabins we are thrown into, our moments of deepest isolation, betrayal, or failure, are not tombs, but crucibles. Life will inevitably push us into the cold, stripping away our comfort and challenging our spirit. But just like Anais, we have the choice to either freeze in the face of adversity or use that harsh environment to forge a stronger, unshakable version of ourselves. Karma has a way of balancing the scales, but true power comes when we no longer seek revenge out of anger, but rise with a quiet, undeniable resilience. If this story of surviving the storm and coming back untouchable resonated with you, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own inner strength, and subscribe for more epic stories of redemption and grit. Keep forging your iron.